Greetings, folks. Welcome. A very popular strategy used in the pursuit of economic development is to build and support industry clusters. In fact, most every state has an industry cluster strategy and sectors that are targeted for growth, and more specifically, most states are looking to build clusters in biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, and high tech. Michael Porter has written extensively about regional industry clusters, and he has conducted research on the keys to building industry clusters. To paraphrase Porter, clusters are defined as a geographic concentration of businesses that make the same or related goods and services, as well as the organizations and policies and infrastructure that provide a supporting network to these businesses. Some of the best known U.S. regional industry clusters are high technology and computers in Silicon Valley, insurance in Hartford, Connecticut, textiles in Dalton, Georgia. In fact, several southern states have clusters of textile plants, high fashion in New York City, finance in New York City, movies and entertainment in Los Angeles, and gaming in Las Vegas. To give you an idea of the complexity of clusters and everything that goes into one, here's a figure of the California wine cluster. This is based on research by MBAs at Harvard that Porter used in one of his journal articles about clusters. You have grape growers and vineyards, wineries and production facilities, companies that provide agricultural inputs, companies that provide inputs to wine production, such as bottles and labels, public relations and advertising firms, and even links to tourism in a broader food cluster in California. That's a lot of interrelated parts that make up a cluster. Although Michael Porter popularized industry clusters in more recent years, many of the benefits of clusters were identified by Alfred Marshall a long time ago. The idea of a cluster is that it provides benefits that are external to the firm, but internal to the cluster and shared by all of its members. One of the benefits noted by Marshall is knowledge spillovers, which are facilitated by clusters. A knowledge spillover is a sharing and flow of information between firms about the industry. Marshall wrote that in an industry cluster, the mysteries of the trade become no mysteries at all. It's as if it's in the air. In other words, if a business operates in an industry cluster, it can learn from others almost by just operating in the area. A second benefit of industry clusters identified by Marshall is the availability of inputs that are specialized to the industry. It could be specialized machinery that businesses use or even specialized services. For example, a high-tech industry cluster will attract legal and financial services that are connected to technology. A final benefit of clusters noted by Marshall is a thick labor market. This means that a cluster will have lots of workers with the skills needed in the industry, as well as lots of employment opportunities for these workers. This helps businesses and workers both. Think about the country music cluster in Nashville. If you want to become a country music singer, you might consider moving to Nashville. Likewise, if your company is looking to hire country music singers, you might be more apt to find them in Nashville than in my old hometown of Newark, Ohio. In addition to the three benefits of industry clusters proposed by Alfred Marshall, Porter added a few additional benefits, such as the presence of supporting infrastructure in a cluster. For example, a cluster might have special transportation or technology-related infrastructure to help the businesses operate. Porter also noted that a critical mass of businesses in a sector will generate high local demand for a company's products or services. Finally, Porter notes that clusters promote an environment of cooperation among businesses, but also competition to constantly improve your operations, which helps businesses grow. A journal article by Ann Markuson talks about 4 different types of industry clusters and the benefits they provide. First, you have what Markuson calls Marshallian clusters, named after Alfred Marshall. These are industry clusters made up of smaller and locally owned businesses that make similar product or service. A Marshallian cluster typically has all of the benefits described by Marshall, such as knowledge spillovers, a thick labor market, and availability of specialized inputs. A hub and spoke cluster is characterized by one large company, that's the hub, and a bunch of smaller companies that supply goods and services to the hub. A good example of a hub and spoke cluster is a large automobile manufacturing plant, that's the hub, with smaller companies that provide inputs and services to the plant. A satellite platform cluster is a group of branch plants of larger multi-establishment firms that are located in close proximity. An industrial park, if it has lots of tenants of established larger firms, is a good example of a satellite platform. Since these branch plants primarily communicate with their headquarters, which could be located far outside the region, knowledge spillovers are minimal in satellite platform clusters. But they could have a thick labor market of workers with skills and experience related to production and manufacturing. Finally, a state-anchored cluster has a large institution such as a university or military base, along with businesses that provide goods and services to the institution and its people. If you look around any large university, you'll find lots of businesses that provide goods and services used by students and university employees. That's a state-anchored cluster. An empirical method that is commonly used to identify industry clusters is location quotients. Location quotients are a measure of the extent to which a region, this could be a state, county, metropolitan area, or town, specializes in the production of a good or service. If a place has a relatively higher percentage of its overall economic activity devoted to a good or service relative to a benchmark economy, then the region has a specialization in the good or service. The formula for calculating location quotient is to calculate the ratio of an industry's percentage of total employment in the region you're studying relative to, or divided by, the industry's percentage of total employment in a benchmark economy, which you select for comparison purposes. The most common benchmark used to calculate location quotients for U.S. metros and states is the overall U.S. economy. Although I show the equation for location quotients using employment data, you can also use data on the number of business establishments. As an example of how you calculate a location quotient, data from 2020 shows that the accommodations and food services sector, this is hotels and restaurants, accounts for about 16% of total employment in Las Vegas. By comparison, this same sector accounts for about 8% of total employment in the United States, which is the benchmark. This gives a location quotient of about 2 for the accommodations and food services sector in Las Vegas. When interpreting location quotients, a value that exceeds 1 tells us that the region specializes in the industry. A value of less than 1 tells us that the industry is underrepresented in the region. And a value of 1 tells us that the industry shares are similar between the region and the benchmark economy. In our example, the location quotient value of 2 for the accommodations and food services sector in Las Vegas tells us that Las Vegas has a specialization in hotels and restaurants. This makes sense given the large number of tourists that visit Las Vegas. Although location quotient tells us the extent to which a specific region specializes in a given sector of the economy, you can actually compare location quotients across regions to figure out the extent to which the sector is geographically concentrated in a few places versus spread out across the country. You just have to make sure that when you compare the location quotients across regions, you are dealing with the same industry. For example, just like I calculated location quotient for the accommodations and food services sector in Las Vegas, I could calculate location quotients for this sector in all of the U.S. metropolitan areas. If an industry has location quotients that are reasonably close to 1 in all regions, this tells us that businesses in the sector are spread out evenly across places in proportion to the amount of overall economic activity. This is what you would expect for a sector such as gas stations. Of course, big places like Chicago and Los Angeles have more gas stations than small places, but the percentage of a region's total employment or total number of businesses accounted for by gas stations is pretty similar across regions. This would give location quotients of close to 1 for gas stations in most all regions, so they're evenly spread out. On the other hand, if an industry has a few regions with high location quotients and the rest are pretty close to 0, then the sector is geographically concentrated in those few places. If you went to an extreme where one region has a large location quotient in the sector and the rest of the regions have location quotients of 0 in that same sector, then you have a case where the sector is operating in only one region of the country. That's the very definition of a high geographic concentration of industry. Here's a scatter plot that's doing double duty. It shows the effect of specialization in textile plants on state economic development, but also, and this is more subtle, it gives us clues about the geographic concentration of textile plants. Let's think about geographic concentration first. In the figure, you see a handful of states with location quotients that are well above 1. Places like North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia have high location quotients, which suggests they specialize in the production of textiles. I mentioned these textile clusters at the beginning of the video. Now, if you look at the left side of the figure, you'll see that lots of states have location quotients that are very close to 0. This means that these states have very little activity in textiles compared with the United States as a whole. A combination of most states having very little activity in textiles and a few regions with high location quotients suggests that the textile manufacturing industry is geographically concentrated in a handful of states, mostly in the southern part of the U.S. Now, let's look at the relationship between state economic development and a region's specialization in textile mill products. On the y-axis, which goes up and down, we have the overall economic development index, which is a combination of the employment index, income index, and the persistence index. So it measures the growth of good jobs in a state. Along the x-axis, as we talked about earlier, you have the location quotients for textile mill products. The downward sloping trend line is dashed, which I use when a relationship is not statistically significant. So we can interpret the scatter plot to mean that specializing in textile mill products does not have an impact, one way or another, on the economic development of states. Now let's look at the relationship between the economic development of U.S. metros and a region's specialization in computer and data processing services. The location quotient is measured as of 1990 because the indicators used in the Economic Development Index are based on data starting back in 1990. So the idea is to see if conditions back in 1990, I was 21 years old at the time, affected the economic development of regions moving forward. Although computers were around back then, it was well before the internet as we know it, smartphones, and many of the technologies that we take for granted. This explains why the computer sector, it's called Computer and Data Processing Services, has such a generic name. If I redid the analysis using industries that are around today, things could look a little different. Nevertheless, the upward sloping and solid trend line shows that there's a positive and statistically significant relationship between the economic development of U.S. metros and specializing in computer and data processing services back in 1990. There might be something to these computers. In addition to textiles and computer and data processing services, I looked at the effects of specializing in 56 other sectors. So I looked at 58 sectors in total. For each sector, I calculated location quotients using data from 1990 to see how specialization at that time affected economic development moving forward. And I did the analysis for states, metropolitan areas, and then large and small metros. Wow, that was a lot of work. Here's a summary of what I found. I found that specializing in energy-related sectors helped economic development. This should not be a surprise, given the importance of energy to almost everything. I also found a positive and statistically significant relationship between the economic development of metros with fewer than 1 million residents, that's what I call small metros, and specialization in transportation and communication sectors. This underscores the importance of having sectors that help a region connect with the rest of the world, especially for smaller regions. Finally, I found that having a specialization in technical and business-related services, such as computer and data processing, engineering, financial, and legal services, helped the economic development of regions starting back in 1990. So there you have it. Energy, computer services, finance, transportation, and communications. These were the sectors that are associated with the growth of good jobs. But what was largely missing was manufacturing. Almost across the board, specializing in practically all types of manufacturing either had no impact or is associated with a reduction in economic development of regions. It's easy to sound like you know what you're doing when you're talking about what happened in the past, because as they say, hindsight is 20/20. But the real question is, could we have predicted these results about the best sectors for economic development back in 1990? I know it's hard to change a region's industrial structure, and it can take decades to happen, but if we had known the best sectors for economic development back in 1990, it could have affected a region's decision-making around the margins. This figure attempts to get at the question of whether back in 1990 we could have predicted the best sectors for economic development moving forward. On the x-axis, or side to side, you have the employment growth rate of industries from 1975 to 1990. This is information that you would have had at your disposal back in 1990. On the y-axis, or up and down, you have a measure that summarizes the effect of industry specialization on metropolitan area economic development. This captures what I was talking about earlier when I said that sectors such as transportation, communications, computer processing, and business services helped the economic development of regions starting back in 1990. All of the points shown in the scatter plot represent different sectors of the economy. The upward sloping trend line, and it's a solid line that I use to show results that are statistically significant, tells us that an industry's past performance, in terms of its growth from 1975 to 1990, was some indication of how the sector impacted economic development in the years after 1990. But there were certainly exceptions to this rule in that sectors grew quite a bit between 1975 and 1990, but they did not have a positive effect on economic development. This all tells us that it would have been difficult to know back in 1990 the types of sectors that might positively impact the economic development of regions. In this video, we've covered a lot of ground related to industries and economic development, so let's end here with a few key takeaways. First, clusters are complex and supporting one takes a lot of work. Second, different types of clusters have different types of impacts on the region, and they require different types of support. Finally, the empirical analysis found that sectors such as energy, transportation, and communications, and technical and business services are important to the economic development of U.S. regions.